There's a certain silence that cuts deeper than words. When someone ignores you, not out of accident but by intention, it triggers something primal. The absence of acknowledgement feels like rejection, but worse. It erases you. And in that void, the mind doesn't find peace. It spirals. It searches for reasons, rewrites reality, and eventually turns inward, whispering one dangerous question: what did I do wrong? Carl Jung warned us about these moments, not because he believed in controlling others, but because he understood the danger of how we react when we feel unseen. Jung believed that much of our suffering doesn't come from what happens to us, but from how we respond to it unconsciously. And nothing activates the unconscious faster than being ignored. The instinct is to chase, to prove your worth, to reclaim visibility. But here's the paradox. The more you do, the more you give away your power. You shift from person to performer, from human to desperate echo. And all the while, your unconscious, your shadow, is feeding on insecurity, on shame, on old wounds that this silence has reopened. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about the shadow self, the parts of you that you disown, that hide beneath the surface, waiting to be triggered. And nothing triggers the shadow like being dismissed. Because it's not just about now. It's about every time you felt invisible. As a child, as a partner, as a friend. The pain is cumulative, and so is the reaction. But here's what most people never realize. The silence isn't the real threat. Your reaction to it is. Most people react to being ignored by doing the very thing that guarantees further rejection. They overcompensate. They message again. They explain themselves. They try to sound calm, composed, or worse, indifferent. But beneath that, there's panic. A quiet desperation that seeps into every word, every action. And whether the other person realizes it or not, the dynamic shifts. You're no longer engaging from equal ground. You're chasing. And that shift is exactly what Jung would warn against. Not because it's morally wrong, but because it fractures your psyche. When you act from a place of needing to be seen, you abandon yourself in exchange for validation. You disconnect from your center. Jung believed that the more we try to be accepted by the world, the more we betray the parts of ourselves that actually matter. Every time you move against your own dignity to gain attention, you're teaching your unconscious that you're not worthy unless someone else says so. And that message becomes a blueprint. Over time, your identity wraps itself around external approval. You become hypersensitive to tone, to silence, to changes in energy. You walk into every room scanning for signs that you belong. You become emotionally vigilant, always guessing what others want from you, and abandoning yourself in the process. Jung would call this a fragmentation of the self. A psyche split into roles: the pleaser, the fixer, the forgiver, the explainer. But underneath all of them, there's one truth. You're afraid that if you do nothing, you'll disappear. But the irony? The more you chase validation, the more invisible you become. To them, and to yourself. Silence isn't a threat. It's a mirror. When someone disregards you, the first instinct is to fill the void with noise, with explanations, apologies, attention-seeking gestures. But Jung would argue, the void isn't the problem. What it reflects back to you is, disregard exposes your attachments, your fear of irrelevance, your need to be chosen, and perhaps most dangerously, your belief that your value is negotiable, that it fluctuates based on who's watching, who's replying, who's validating. But that's not identity. That's dependence. Jung taught that true power comes from differentiation, from separating your worth from how others treat you. The moment you tie your sense of self to someone else's attention, you've handed them the controls to your emotional stability. That's not love. That's not even connection. It's quiet servitude, disguised as care. So what should you never do when they ignore you? You should never abandon your inner stillness. Never panic. Never contort yourself to become more visible in someone else's eyes. Because in doing so, you confirm the one belief that's been quietly destroying your life, that you need to be more than you are to be enough. When someone pulls away, it's not a call to chase. It's an invitation to return to yourself, to see what part of you is still holding on to the idea that being seen by them is more important than seeing yourself. Because here's the truth Jung hinted at. Being disregarded doesn't hurt because they stopped caring. It hurts because you started believing that their silence defines you. If this reflection feels uncomfortably true, subscribe and hit the bell. You're not just watching, you're waking up. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes when you stop begging to be seen. The moment you stop performing, stop explaining, stop trying to be enough for someone who has already chosen silence, something shifts. You realize that attention was never the currency of your worth. Presence is. Jung believed that much of our suffering comes from confusing the two, from believing that being noticed means being valued. But the truth is far colder. People notice what benefits them. They pay attention when it suits their needs. That doesn't mean you matter. It means you're useful. And when your usefulness fades, so does their focus. But here's where real inner power begins. When you stop needing to be useful, to be worthy. Because the more you chase after being seen, the more invisible you become to yourself. You shrink. You compromise. You edit your truth. And in doing so, you send a message to your unconscious. Your silence is louder than my voice. Your validation is more important than my boundaries. That is the kind of fracture that turns confidence into compliance. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Jung's warning wasn't just about others. It was about the self. About how easily we abandon our center in the name of belonging. But belonging that requires self-erasure is not belonging. It's exile, in disguise. So the next time someone ignores you, remember, it's not a message about your worth. It's a mirror showing you where you still seek permission to exist. And the most dangerous thing you can do in that moment is believe the silence. Power isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself with anger or confrontation. Sometimes, power looks like silence too, but not the kind that begs, the kind that chooses. Jung understood that true self-possession means learning to sit with discomfort without needing to escape it. When you're ignored, your nervous system screams for resolution, a reply, a sign, a fix. But that impulse isn't coming from wisdom. It's coming from the wounded child inside you, the one who once felt invisible, unworthy, forgotten. And now, every silence feels like a return to that moment. But this time, you're not a child. This time, you have a choice. You can choose not to chase. You can choose to hold your posture. You can choose to be with the discomfort, fully, without explaining, justifying, or shrinking. That is power. Not because it feels good, but because it proves something to your unconscious. I will not abandon myself just because someone else did. And when you do that, something incredible happens. The grip loosens. The obsession fades. You begin to see the situation not through the lens of desperation, but through clarity. You see the manipulation, whether intentional or not. You see the imbalance. You see how much you were trying to earn something that should never have been conditional in the first place. Carl Jung wrote, "Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health." He wasn't romanticizing struggle. He was exposing the truth, that avoidance of pain leads to fragmentation, That every time you bypass the lesson, you delay the healing. So when someone disregards you, don't rush to escape the discomfort. Look at it. Feel it. Let it teach you where your wounds still control you. And then, don't act from that place. Because here's the mistake most people make. They feel the wound, but they react from it. They lash out. They beg. They become performative. And in doing so, they confirm the very fear that drives the wound, that they are powerless. But you're not. You are only as powerless as your willingness to trade peace for attention. At some point, you stop waiting for the apology. You stop needing them to explain why they pulled away, why they went silent, why they made you feel invisible. Because you realize they didn't silence you. You silenced yourself long before they did. Jung believed that most suffering isn't caused by external events. It's caused by internal disconnection. When we aren't anchored in who we are, every little shift outside of us feels like an earthquake. Someone's silence, it feels like rejection. Someone's mood feels like judgment. Someone pulling away feels like proof that we are, at our core, unlovable. But the truth is, no one can make you feel invisible unless you've already doubted your own visibility. That's the trap. We wait for people to reflect back our worth, instead of recognizing that their reflection is always distorted by their own lens, their wounds, their fears, their immaturity. Jung would say that the more unconscious someone is, the less capable they are of seeing you clearly. So why are you defining yourself by their blindness? This is where power returns. Not in confrontation, but in clarity. When you're ignored, you're offered a choice. Spiral into self-abandonment, or stand still in self-respect. Not because it feels powerful, but because it is. Real power is quiet. It doesn't beg. It doesn't perform. It doesn't seek revenge or closure. It holds. And holding doesn't mean pretending not to care. It means feeling the ache fully and choosing not to shrink because of it. The moment you stop trying to prove your worth, you start remembering it. That's what Jung was pointing at when he said, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." It's not about fixing them. It's not about decoding their silence. It's about recognizing that their silence revealed the parts of you that still crave external permission to exist. And once you see that, you can choose something different. You can choose not to react. You can choose to sit in your own presence, to honor the parts of you that were never meant to be negotiable. There's a kind of power that doesn't roar, it doesn't post, it doesn't chase, it doesn't ask, "Why don't you see me?" It simply stands, still, silent, self-possessed. And when someone ignores you, that's exactly the version of you that you need to return to. Because by now, you've seen it clearly. Chasing doesn't bring connection. Explaining doesn't bring closure. Performing doesn't bring peace. What brings peace is alignment, a return to your own center, a refusal to beg for something that was never freely given. Jung taught that the more unconscious we are, the more likely we are to collapse into reaction. But the moment you observe the urge to react, you gain distance from it. And in that distance, something sacred happens. Choice. You can choose stillness. You can choose silence. You can choose not to abandon yourself, even when someone else has. And that choice, quiet as it may be, is the birth of inner authority. No longer trying to control the narrative. No longer waiting for closure that will never come. No longer mistaking someone else's absence for your unworthiness. Because when they ignore you, it reveals more about them than it does about you. But how you respond, that reveals everything about you. So ask yourself, do I sit in this silence with grounded self-respect? or with hidden fear disguised as pride? That's the kind of self-inquiry that Carl Jung believed would save you. Not from them, but from yourself. And if that question stung even a little, then you're ready for what comes next. Because there's another pattern, another trap, that's far more subtle and far more destructive. Overthinking. The voice that doesn't scream, it spirals. The thoughts that don't shout, they drown you. And often, what we call deep thinking is actually a clever disguise for fear, for avoidance, for paralysis. In the next video, we explore how the mind, your greatest tool, can also become your biggest prison. Nietzsche had something to say about it, and it might just break the loop you're stuck in. Watch next. How overthinking always leads to loss. Nietzsche's insight.